Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns Those Anti-Federalists. They absolutely got it right here with Tom Novolis, your host. And I am so delighted that you're back with me again this week. Just been a real interesting week. We're going to kind of do a little bit more on storytelling to some extent and weaving in all of those mirrors of history and talk about those truths that are from the foundational, yeah, from the very foundational. I listened to a friend. Well, I guess I could call him a friend. I knew him way back when, and even today, somewhat stay in contact with him. He's a very interesting pastor, theologian in the Reformed movement, has been for quite a while. And one of the discussions that he brought about a couple weeks ago, maybe longer, depending on where you find him on YouTube, is that what is it that we are trying to conserve if you call yourself a conservative? Well, as you see on the bookshelf here, that, and I talked with Dr. Mike Spalding about one of my books is Not All Conservatives Are Constitutionalists, and that the issue of conservatism is such a broad spectrum that when you hear it all over the media and you hear it from all of the different talking heads, we try to look at it from that perspective of, well, what does it mean? I mean, that's a perspective. And to look at, it's one of those, boy, it's like a spider web all into itself. You have all these different flavors. And when I start looking at and grabbing a hold of all of those different concepts that I brought together in that book, and yes, you can find it at least you can find the link to it on samueladamsreturns.net, and that'll take you to Amazon, but it's easier to use the link to go ahead and get the book and talking about all these ideas. But the question was by this pastor theologian, the question was, what are we trying to preserve? What are we trying to conserve? To conserve is to preserve. And how does that all tie in together when we're looking at the fundamentals of what is happening in our nation? And to the real question is that are we trying to conserve by returning to something? We hear out there all the time people jumping up and down, especially in the liberty movement, that, oh gosh, we got to return to the Constitution, return to the Constitution. And yes, I'm also plugging the other book. And as my friend Dr. Kimber will say, is that we're in two constitutions. And in fact, someone else sent me an article talking about two constitutions. So here we have a real problem. The problem are multiple problems. One problem being, if we look at it only in the framework of government and governance, how are we being governed? And if we're looking at it from that perspective of conservatism versus everything we're seeing right now that is all about socialism, and what we've been talking about for the last several weeks is how does that impact us? What's happening there? Is like, oh gosh, what is it that the Constitution has? And I've talked about all of these other issues for quite a period of time. And then I started thinking about, okay, what does that all mean then in relationship to the church? And we talked about some of those aspects of the church from the last couple programs, introducing the ideas as the transforming the world by subverting the church. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Conforming the church to the New World Order gets to that whole point of what are we in a sense of influence, if you will, within the whole idea of our society and how do we make good government function. Well, that's a lot to ponder. I mean, those are a lot of interesting questions to look at. And as I always say, that this is a program that looks at the mirrors in history. So one of the fundamental questions that was brought out by this pastor theologian in the Reformed movement is that what are we trying to conserve, preserve? Um, who are we in relationship to all of that? Can we go back to something? Can we go back to those fundamentals? And can we go back? I think more importantly, the broader question was, what are we trying to go back to the 1800s? Are we trying to go back to that period when the Constitution was constructed? I talk about it so often that there are the dynamics, the parallels between now and then. And those dynamics, those parallels are based on human nature. Are things exactly the same? No. Do we still have commerce? Yes. Do we still have those people and influences that impact the capacity and the way that we do commerce? Yes. Do we have a fiscal concern, budgetary concerns, debt concerns? Yes. Are they exactly the same as the past? No, but in principle, they're very, very similar. Is the way that we are commingled with internationalists the same as the past? No, because when we broke away from Great Britain, we fundamentally broke away in all manners and had to reestablish our trade, treaties, and so on. Were we looking at principles on how to retain our sovereignty within the context of all of that? Well, yeah, we were talking about with George Washington, for 8 years in this new experiment, what he was bringing out. And I ran those parallels for you over the course of several programs as to George Washington's farewell address and some of the things that Donald Trump is trying to do and restore. And not restore from the period of the 18th, 1800s, 1700s, but to actually take and look at the principles upon which it means for us to be a free people. So as I continued to ponder that, I came upon, once again in my reading, my favorite little book that I haven't brought to you in a little while, that I thought that I'd refresh a few ideas, because I think the ideas are that there are a number, especially within the mega churches, the well-known environments and all of that, they don't know fundamentals and truths because they have recreated all these other things that they want to do. It's a credibility question as well. Here was one of the other things before I get into my favorite little book. It was the credibility question for yourselves, as much as it is from that idea of who's this guy, Tom Navolis, and what is it that he has to say of any value or anything like that. It was interesting now, I think it's been over, back in the days, back in Vancouver, Washington, when we lived there, I think that was the 2008, 2009. So I'll go 10 years back when we were doing a number of different things with We the People. And it was real interesting is that the local newspaper there in Clark County, Washington, one of the writers, we got to know them pretty well. And an article during an election cycle, major election cycle, and many of the things that I was doing and interacting with. She wrote about me in that newspaper as a self-styled constitutionalist. And I went, oh, wow. I really took that as a compliment because if we remember that General Gage said that the colonists, the people that were during that period of time, were smatterers in the law. So the point that I want to drive to, as we'll definitely have to get into it more in the third segment, is on my little book. But what I wanted to introduce you to is that we should be smatterers of the law, but our educational system and our churches have taken us away from that. And even from that biblical perspective, they've taken us away from that to the extent that uh, people go after what my friend Dr. Spalding has noted, uh, after personality instead of after biblical truth. And we've seen that really start to come about, way back in 1962 and in maybe some of the earlier periods in time, as we saw many types of transitions in the churches. And what does it take to understand the gospel? It's almost to some extent that as much as there are on Bible studies and everything that are out there, it's how do you really understand what the scripture has to say for yourself? Also, that ties into what's happened in education to the extent that all of these volumes right over here, if you're looking on the on YouTube and on samadamsreturns.net, you'll see me pointing to all of these books from the University of Chicago that I reference over and over and over, called the Founders Constitution. People talk about reading the Federalist Papers. I always say you can't understand the Federalist Papers without reading and understanding the Anti-Federalist Papers. And if you want to get the broader picture, you need to go to those volumes, which are online from the University of Chicago, the Founders Constitution, to understand that deeper picture of governance. But we're all supposed to be those self-styled constitutionalists and smatterers in the law because that's what our founders intended. They wanted us to understand these principles. That's it. All of that rambling has now taken us to exactly where we need to be from what are we trying to conserve? We are trying to conserve and apply not anything from the past as let's go back to doing that and let's go back to wearing mud shoes and moccasins. No. What we're trying to conserve is the values, the truths, everything that is wrapped into the principles of the foundation. And the principles of the foundation are, in fact, which we're going to talk about in the third segment, because in the second segment here, I'm going to be bringing out some of those ideas and principles of Sam Adams. But when we get to that third segment, I'm going to bring out those principles and ideas from my favorite little book that I talk about. But that's what conservatism should be looking to, are foundational principles. But so much like Thomas Sowell said in Intellectuals and Society, we have all of these manipulated principles that are new that are called conservatism because some intellectual has dreamed them up or written about them or. And I'm not talking about the oars in the water either. They get us going somewhere. So that's what we have to look at, I think, today, is that as you're looking at the media and we're seeing all of the confusion that's happening, even with the sale of Fox News, where are we going to go to find those principles? And in fact, we have to go back to Sam Adams as he has returned and definitely dive into those anti-federalists because they got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists absolutely got it right. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. And as I always do on this segment, is to say, hey, welcome to Liberty Works Radio Network as the primary sponsor for this program. And I am so delighted that you're looking at Liberty Works Radio Network and listening to it because there's so much value there. And it is a listener-funded network. Just, look at it. Check it out. And those that are here normally every Saturday, I thank you so very much. And that you are participating in what the network has overall all week long. So, when you do, check out that donate button as well and contribute what you can. I know that the folks at Liberty Works Radio Network really, really appreciate everything that folks can do and what they can contribute. So as I finished the last segment, we finished talking about those principles, those values, trying to get back to the root of those. And where I wanted to go in this segment was to say a little bit more about Sam Adams, because as you well know, Sam Adams is really what the name of the program is, who I try and bring the value proposition from that position. And it's just an interesting place to dig into the values and principles. And I really haven't done that for a while. So I thought that today I'd like to revisit some things in that historical perspective. And if we put it in not necessarily those exact principles, that's something that I'm going to maybe work on a little bit more. And I'll probably do another little short book about the principles of Samuel Adams, which are so different than the book out there on Samuel Adams that somebody else did. So where I'd like to start, which I thought is a really interesting place instead of going into all of his writings, but there were a whole series of writings, and it was interesting. It's called, the whole series are the Great Americans of History series. Included Thomas Jefferson, James Otis, John Hancock, Sam Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Randolph, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and Abraham Lincoln. So they all came from the H.G. Campbell Publishing Company out of Milwaukee. Hey, you can get them. They're really at a good discounted price. According to this manuscript that I have here, that they were $1 a volume, $1 a volume, or you could get that whole set for $12. Yeah, for $12. But you want to know something? That was back in 98, 1898, between 1898 and 1905-ish. So you missed the deal. Sorry. But this volume here that I am going to talk about is Samuel Adams, A Character Sketch. We're not going to get into the whole thing. We never have time to do it. But I want to get into just the introduction a bit because I think that speaks volumes to what I was trying to address in the first segment. This was put together by a Dr. Samuel Fallows. He was a doctor in divinity. He was a superintendent of public instruction of Wisconsin for the whole state of Wisconsin. He was the ex-president of Illinois Wesleyan University and the chancellor of the University Association. And this was published in 1903. Interesting thing that Dr. Fellows brings out right from the beginning, and I love this. I use a bit of it in my second book, That is available for you there at samueladamsreturns.net. Uh, he goes this: there is, probably speaking, no ancient history, no medieval history, no modern history. History is one. The ages are all united. Assyrian, Babylon, Egypt, Palestine, Greece, Rome, Holland, France, Spain, Germany, and England all have to do with the particular life of America today. I have to stop there for a second because that was clearly understood at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, maybe not so. But it was more clearly understood by virtue of what Dr. Fallows was saying. Today, the majority of the students that are going through the indoctrination machine, yes, that's what I'll call it, the indoctrination machine, have no idea about the content and context of all that I just said, all these different histories in relationship to America and its relevance to today. Because all they want people to know, as I mentioned in the last segment, is socialism, communism, no American history, only this globalist insanity. Well, Dr. Fellows continues, lessons of importance can be learned from each of them to help us act intelligently in performance of the duties developed upon us. We have to be able to intelligently act upon duties that are put to us, whether that's raising a family, working with other people, your job, your economy, every aspect of life. It has been well said, quote, there is no romance like the romance of history. Indeed, in a large sense, history is romance, for life itself is strange and mysterious, and all its happenings are filled with dramatic elements which need but the touch of imagination to glow, as the dull carbon flashes into light when quickened by the electric current. All the years have voices for them that will hear, and even the simple annals of commonplace events have in them the heart of epic possibilities. End quote. I think about that because this last week, Kathy and my dad and myself went down to see the Ark uh, down there in Kentucky. If you get a chance, go check that out. The it is an epic uh, adventure, if you will, and to take the time to look at that and what stories it tells that have not only the biblical validity but have engineering wonder, the possibilities, the rest of, as they say, where they have to take some poetic license, if you will, but also the scientific component of it. And what I imagine much of the research that was done with the Creation Museum as well, the fossils, the technologies that we have today to bring something like that to life. And as you go through it, just from the biblical adventure of it out of Genesis, as I had to reread a couple of times this week after we went at the beginning of the week, was that you can see to complete what God may have detailed even more than what he did inside of the biblical description of the flood, of Noah taking and having to construct the ark, but to take and think about the engineering in sustaining all of the animals and sustaining all of life for that basically a year uh, locked into the ark. And remember, I say locked in because God brought the animals, then he shut the door. And the door did not open to the ark until he opened the door. Interesting. Interesting to think about in relationship to other areas of life. But the possibilities, the imagination on all of that. So we don't have a lot of time left here, but one of the things that I wanted to look at, again, in this about Samuel Adams, wasn't Samuel Adams itself, but what was happening. The English Revolution under Cromwell, the greatest of Britain's rulers, was the forerunner of the American Revolution. Now that's interesting to hear that. The greatest of the British rulers at that time, this person believes, was Cromwell. And there's a couple of paragraphs I'm going to jump over, and it goes to this then. The inhabitants of the 4 New England colonies, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, in 1750 were most of them the great-grandsons and the great-great-grandsons of the 1,000 Puritans who crossed the ocean between 1620 and 1640 and settled New England. Scarcely 2 men in 100 were of other than English blood. These men in general owned the ground on which they lived. Nearly everyone could, and this is important because we don't have this anymore. Nearly everyone could read and write, and above all, could think. That right there is astounding, because in everything that's going on the social emotional learning, which we've talked about, and so many other aspects of the indoctrination system, we really don't have people that can think. In fact, we don't have a lot of people that can really read and write. You may be able to, where is it? Here's my phone, and we can take, and we can sit there and you can text message all day long. But the realities are, how many people can construct a pretty decent sentence and communicate within that type of medium? Not many. It's easier to do a video and blabber, blabber, blabber all over YouTube. I think it's real interesting is that so many people get millions of hits, thousands. Okay, it's back away from the millions, but things go viral. And when you listen to it, you're going, that person can't even construct a basic sentence and communicate effectively, yet it's like a wow. Whereas when we think about the fundamental principles and what it takes to govern, the fundamental principles upon which we look at as to what are we conserving, what is it that we are trying to establish and maintain and hold within the context of good governance. And I missed it to some extent, is that I didn't get into everything about Sam Adams. But what I wanted to finish just real quickly with is that all people during that foundational period really were on a point of political equality. That each individual had the right of delivering his own opinion, no matter how poor and humble. These New England town meetings, which they had, played a most important part in the history of American independence. And now we have to have an executive order to tell these institutions of indoctrination that everybody has to be able to freely speak because they think. Wasn't that a Moody Blues song about I think? Or it goes back into Greek philosophy, I think, therefore I am. Well, the real reality is that God made us thinking beings. He made us those that have that great creativity. So when it comes to understanding what is it from this beginning and what we're trying to conserve, we have to look at it is the fundamental principles of thinking, of reading, of writing, of mathematics, not emotionalism. We have to get beyond that. And therefore, we have to redo these institutions of indoctrination starting at kindergarten all the way through graduate school and beyond. Sam Adams was a thinker, and that's what brought him to the point of saying liberty over despotism, and that is for you as well. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this last segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. And the question to you is there liberty? Is there such a thing as liberty? That's something that Sam Adams asked, back in, I think it was about 1746 in one of the papers that he wrote. I don't have it in front of me at the moment. And yes, being 300 years old, I know that my memory does slip from time to time. But the question goes, and has to tie back into what we were talking about in the first segment and a bit in the second, is that what are we trying to conserve? What is it that we're trying to bring to light? What does it mean to take and govern and have government function in such a manner that there are, as I talked about in the last segment, fundamental principles by which are universal? What are those universal truths? Is there such a thing as liberty? I say, I submit to you there is. And as I've told you, and I try to get you to think, as we talked about in the last segment, is the idea that the real liberty, not the libertarian liberty or the liberty that we've seen in some of the historical references of the Greeks or the Romans and whomever, the real liberty is only in Jesus Christ. That's what really set America really free. Sam Adams also asked that question relative to liberty. What is there tyranny? Is there tyranny? Well, I wanted to read to you a few things here because I just think it's important. I'm going to go to my little reference book and I'm going to hold it up for those that are watching this on YouTube, and you can see it. It is They Preached Liberty. I love this little book. I read it from time to time, often, because I think that what's in here is very important. I mentioned this, so I'm jumping back and forth on this thought, but I mentioned this to you before that Kathy and I have seriously looked because we're finding that within the majority of the churches out there, they don't teach everything necessary to implement that God-given liberty within the context of the church. So to have that fullness, we're going to start, a study, and we'll be announcing that to the folks that are in our closer circle within Northeast Ohio, so that they can know when we're going to actually be doing that. But when I looked at this, I looked at this one section here called The Divine Source of Liberty. And this is from an election sermon in 1776 by Samuel West. Providence has designed this continent. Now, one of the churches, the major, largest church here in Northeast Ohio that Kathy and I had attended in the past, I had the pastors tell me that there's nothing special about America. And I vehemently disagree with that. So here's Samuel West's thought on that in his election sermon of 1776. Providence has designed this continent. For my part, when I consider the dispensations of Providence toward this land ever since our fathers first settled in Plymouth, which I spoke about in the last segment, I find abundant reason to conclude that the great sovereign of the universe has planted a vine in this American wilderness, which he has caused to take deep root, and it has filled the land. It has filled the land. and that he will never suffer it to be plucked up or destroyed. Our fathers fled from the rage of prelatical tyranny and persecution, and came into this land to enjoy liberty of conscience, and they have increased to a great people. Could I see a spirit of repentance and reformation prevail through the land, I should not have the slightest apprehension of fear of being brought under the iron rod of slavery, even though all the power of the globe were combined against us. And though I confess that the irreligious and profaneness which are so common among us give something of a damp to my spirits, yet I cannot help hoping and ever believing that Providence has designed this continent for to be the asylum of liberty and true religion. Wow. I'm blown away about this, the whole election sermon, and we're going to be talking about in our studies those sermons of the founding era, and this whole sermon by Samuel West is one that we're going to be studying. So here's the deal, is that with all of the evil that we have going on in America today, all that we have in the institutions of indoctrination, all that we have with the murderers and murderesses in the abortion clinics and everywhere else, what we have with the jihadists, what we have with the immorals that have this predominant picture in the media. Samuel West talks about this. He talks about this of the irreligious and profaneness which are so common among us give something of a damp to my spirits. But what does he say before that? He talks about the spirit of repentance and reformation. Ladies and gentlemen, this is something that it was profound during our founding era, was repentance and reformation. And the Reformation happened in the churches. It wasn't just this blanket thing on going out there and just happening, in the streets, which some of it did. I mean, Whitefield was a great preacher that had to go preach out in the fields. He had to go out there and preach, from stumps or from platforms that were built for him so that his voice would carry over thousands. Even Franklin built and had built a large auditorium built for him in Philadelphia so that he could come and preach. So, the key points here is that divine providence, the sovereign of the universe, has planted a vine in America. Wake up to it. It's not what we're going to conserve and preserve from a political perspective. It all has to start right here. And don't let your spirits be dampened, because that same divine providence has designed the continent to be an asylum of liberty and true religion. And not for illegals, but for legals, okay? That was the intent here. So let's kind of zip on to this other portion as I was thinking about this on the nature of tyranny. Nature of tyranny. By seasonable precaution, those nations which are not now groaning under the iron scepter of tyranny were once free. Venezuela, I've talked about Venezuela, was a very free country, now is groaning under tyranny. They were once free. So they might probably have remained by a seasonable precaution against despotic measures. Civil tyranny is usually small in its beginning, like, quote, the drop of a bucket, till the length like a mighty torrent or raging waves of the sea, it bears down all before it, and deluges whole countries and empires. Thus it is as to ecclesiastical tyranny also, the most cruel, intolerable, and impious of any. From small beginnings, it exalts itself above all that is called God and that is worshipped. People have no security against being unmercifully priest-ridden or pastor-ridden, personality pastor-ridden, but by keeping all imperious bishops and other clergy who love to lord it over God's heritage from getting their foot into the stirrup at all. Let them once be fairly mounted, and their beasts, their laity, may prance and flounce about to no purpose. And they will at length be so jaded and hacked by the revered jockeys that they will not even have spirit enough to complain that their backs are galled, or, like Balaam's ass, to rebuke the madness of the prophet. Jonathan Mayhew, in a preface to his sermon, Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Power, 1750. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of that going on, so much going on, in that we're not only seeing the tyranny of the socialism, what we saw in Venezuela, and how much I said when I was down there a number of times, where those that I met with were business leaders and some resistant political leaders were saying that Jimmy Carter introduced Chavez, and they despised Jimmy Carter because of what he did there, but also because of the tyranny of religious leaders and what they instituted in their religious organizations, whether they were Protestant or Catholic. We have that today. We are institutionalizing tyranny within the church by either those which, here we have Jonathan Mayhew talking about, that they are ecclesiastical tyranny is being allowed in like that drop in the bucket because of no action. Or because we have seen within, again, the institutions of not teaching what we've been talking about, those fundamental principles that we're trying to conserve, those fundamental principles which we're trying to preserve, those fundamental truths that are only the total, in-depth, movement of the gospel into every aspect of life, what I call the extensible gospel. It has to be in every aspect of everything that there is. I don't have the time to jump into a couple of the others here, but there's one that I would like to say from Edward Dorr. "'Tis certain that the gospel, above all other religions, instruct mankind in the duties they owe unto their lawful rulers." And then it goes on is that for the lawful rulers, they need to submit themselves to the gospel. The lawful rulers. People may be deceived. The people may be deceived. They may be betrayed by the men in whom they put their confidence. But they deserve to be abandoned by providence if they trust their interests with men whom they know to be either weak or wicked. So when it comes to those elected officials or those that are being elected, if they are known to be wicked, if they are known to be weak, if they're known to be deceivers, they're not to be elected. And when you put your trust in them, you know what? You deserve what you get. So when we wrap this all up, go look at what is it that we're trying to conserve. You need to study that. You need to study and look at what it means that they preached liberty. What are those truths? What are those fundamentals? What is it that is true conservatism? It's not just about the economy, stupid. It's about the core principles. Because we're not going back to 1880, 1776. We're implementing today truth and principles that Samuel Adams talked about, and those anti-federalists did what? They did. They absolutely got it right.